Hello and welcome to this session on cancer survivors at work. My name's Bevan. I'm head of HR research development at the Institute for Employment Studies, and I'm joined by Barbara Wilson, who's chief executive of Working with Cancer. And Barbara will say a little bit more about herself in a second. We're going to be speaking to you today about the issue of cancer survivors at work and how employers can do better to support people who are cancer survivors finish their treatment, as well as those who've received an initial diagnosis. At the Institute for Employment Studies, I've done a lot of work over the years looking at the health of the working age population and on workplace interventions to support people who had been living with and working with chronic illness. So I've had the privilege of working with lots of people who have very difficult health conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, Crohn's disease, schizophrenia, and so on. And I felt that I'd developed some insight into the challenges that these people faced, both in coping with their condition, but also trying to live fulfilling working lives. But then in 2018, I myself was diagnosed with cancer of the esophagus. So I no longer had to imagine what the impact of a chronic condition might be on both life and work. And I've been back at work now for 18 months. And I've had great support from my colleagues at IES. But I am still haunted, like many people are, by the prospect that my cancer will return. Depending on how you calculate it, only 18% of people with my cancer survive for 5 years. So when, as yesterday, as it happened, I was invited to speak at an event in September 2022, I said yes with a whimsical smile, knowing that there's a chance I might not make it. Of course, cancer is one of those issues that, for people of my generation at least, was always a death sentence. People were absolutely terrified of cancer. And yet we've seen remarkable advances in cancer survivorship. And we want to talk about the concept of survivorship in the work setting, because there are lots of mythology about it and lots of misunderstandings. And that may in part explain why some of the outcomes for people surviving cancer are so poor. Just by way of context then, it's important to recognise that about half of those people who are born after 1960 will have a cancer diagnosis during their lives. So it's a very common condition. But the treatment for cancer and the proportion of people surviving cancer treatment has improved dramatically, particularly in some cancers. But despite that, the return to work rates amongst cancer survivors remains depressingly low. And so Barbara and I, in this presentation, have drawn on our own lived experience and our experience through our work to explore why this might be and what can be done to improve things. Of course, the COVID-19 situation has complicated the picture for the clinically vulnerable. Working age cancer survivors represent a large group of people for whom the pandemic has added another layer of distress. We know that many patients have had either a diagnosis or a treatment delayed, increasing their already elevated levels of anxiety. Even for survivors like myself, there can be that haunting feeling that despite having come through the treatment, not only can our disease return, but exposure to the virus might prove to be a traumatic experience. So my guess is that for many people who are living with chronic illnesses and disabilities, the isolation of lockdown has been distinctly double-edged. For some people, it's provided a relatively safe space to work and to contribute to something worthwhile. But for others, it can only emphasize the solitude of being ill. There are a number of facts that I'd just like to draw to your attention by way of context before handing over to Barbara to talk about her work with employers. But these are sobering facts that everyone needs to recognize. I won't go through them all in massive detail, but there are predicted to be 25 million cancer diagnoses each year by 2035. It's currently 14 million. So the prevalence and incidence of cancer is still rising. About half of cancer diagnoses are amongst people of working age. And obviously that's likely to increase as retirement ages extend and we have to work longer because of pension issues. Just 2/3 of employees with cancer have returned to work or are still working a year after diagnosis. The cost of productivity losses, this is across the EU, due to premature death from cancer, This is per person in 2018 was nearly 220,000 euros. Working people between 45 and 65 are over 3.5 times more likely to leave work permanently as a result of their condition. An estimate in 2009 put the total cost of cancer in the UK at 126 billion, with lost work productivity making up half of that number. It's estimated that at least 83 million working days were lost to cancer and cancer-related illness across the EU, and cancer-related productivity losses in the EU range from 52 to 75 billion, about 0.6 of EU GDP. So this is really very significant. These are slightly dehumanizing facts, but we are talking about real people and their families when we're looking at this. But if these slightly more economic data aren't enough to convince governments and policymakers and employers that more should be done to try and support cancer survivors to return productively to work, then I'm not sure what more evidence we need. So if cancer survival is improving, but return to work rates are sluggish, what more do we need to do to find out why this is and to help employers provide more timely and practical and effective support? So I'm now going to hand over to Barbara, who'll introduce herself and talk about the experience she's had from her own work supporting cancer survivors in workplaces. Barbara.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and hello, everybody. My name is Barbara Wilson. I run a social enterprise called Working with Cancer. I was diagnosed with breast cancer in 2005 while I was working as a human resources director in the city. And I found it really tough returning to work. I found people were lovely to me while I was off sick, but once I came back to work, there were a lot of questions about why I was coming back and did I really have a role anymore because other people had been doing my job while I was away. And I realized that there was very little support at that stage for people trying to manage work and cancer. So when I retired from corporate life in 2012, I set up the organization, and we provide coaching, training and consultancy support to employers and their employees for anyone affected by cancer. So that's people with cancer and also carers, friends and family. And as a social enterprise, the money we make from working with big organizations funds, subsidizes work we do with charities and with individuals who can't afford coaching support, can't afford to pay for that. So we're a self-funding social enterprise. So what I want to talk about today is really the typical challenges, the unspoken issues and truths that lay behind some of the facts that Stephen went through earlier. And first of all, I wanted to talk about some of the issues for cancer survivors. And I know Stephen and I relate to these personally because we've been through some of these ourselves. And the first thing to understand is that cancer is not one illness. There's over 200 different forms of cancer. And people typically don't actually understand all the issues around their cancer treatment and diagnosis. They particularly don't understand the side effects of cancer, which are both physical and psychological. And that recovery isn't sort of a matter of progressing, getting better 1 week after the next week, and in 6 to 8 weeks, you're fine. It's non-linear, and it may well take a year or more to recover from your cancer. And as I'll come on to later, of course, many people can live with an incurable but treatable cancer for many years, and dealing with that is clearly very difficult. Also, people really don't know how to talk about their cancer at work. You know, people tend not to talk very much about their personal lives, and they feel awkward, sometimes very embarrassed. You know, if you're a woman with breast cancer and have an older boss, it may not be something you want to talk about very much. People don't understand their legal rights. They actually are allowed things like adjustments, time off the medical appointments, flexible working and so forth. What's particularly difficult is that the end of treatment is not the end of cancer. As I think Churchill once said, it's just the end of the beginning. The period after treatment can be more difficult in terms of side effects like neuropathy, pain, disfigurement, psychological issues, that period after treatment can be more difficult than actually the period of active treatment when people are having, say, chemotherapy or radiotherapy. Very often people will be pointed to use an EAP program, but picking up a phone to somebody you don't really know is not something people want to do. And typically EAP programs are underutilized and frankly insufficient. Well-meaning in their provision, but not necessarily effective in the way they're used. And last but not least, and something people often don't realize, is that cover arrangements can be really difficult to manage, even when an individual is consulted. And I remember people covering my role and being quite concerned that they weren't doing the job that I felt they should be doing. I felt that they might be taking my job away from me and so forth. And those kinds of issues are experienced by many people who are going through cancer treatment, concern about what's happening to their job while they're away. So moving on, and you can see that this is sort of like the other half of the coin in terms of the challenges for employers. They will have had typically very little experience of managing people with cancer. When we're coaching individuals with cancer, we typically coach their boss at the same time. And most of them will have never managed somebody with cancer before. So classically, they won't know how it affects people. They'll make false comparisons. They might say, oh, yes, I know somebody who had that, and assume that the individual they're managing will have the same experience. And that's absolutely not the right thing to assume. Most managers don't know how to talk about cancer. The classic thing I hear is, well, I didn't know what to say, and I didn't want to upset them, so I thought it best to say nothing. That is not really a recipe for success. Most employers don't understand they have a legal responsibility to provide adjustments, not only during cancer, but after the treatment is finished. People are protected throughout their lives, well after treatment, until they die. So employers have a duty, a responsibility to their employee, not just during their active treatment. They will put, as I say, false reliance on EAP programs or on things like a phased return. Standard phased return might be 8 to 12 weeks, and they expect people to be fully fit after 12 weeks. As I said earlier, it can take many months, if not years, to recover from cancer. And last but not least, cover arrangements, as I mentioned earlier, can cause problems. I've had the case where an employer has actually preferred the person they've put in to cover the role of somebody with cancer, and have actually then actively tried to remove the person from cancer or to persuade them not to come back because they actually think the person covering the job is doing a better job. That is really not good management practice. And then moving on, healthcare professionals, well, bless them, they treat the patient, but not the person, and will typically profess not to understand the world of work. So the advice they give to cancer patients may often be very vague, like go back to work when you're ready. But of course, how do you know when you're ready? Colleagues can be very supportive, but they can also move into what I call sympathy fatigue, as in, oh God, they're not going sick again, or yeah, they look really well. I mean, that's one of the issues with cancer survivors. We often look terrific, but we're not terrific inside. And if you look good, your colleagues may think actually you're really quite well and you're just milking the situation. I've come across that several times. Working carers, I won't say, I mean, it's a whole presentation in itself, but very often they don't actually identify themselves, will take sick leave, will not understand how they're protected at work, and often have hugely stressful time trying to support a child or a loved one, an adult, and trying to juggle work and supporting a loved one who's going through cancer treatment. And lastly, families and friends can, yes, be a help, but they can also be a hindrance, providing, one of the things Stephen mentioned earlier was families, generations where they don't like talking about cancer. So a mother or father may not be speaking to somebody very much about their cancer and providing support. Families also want to hear positive news all the time. Don't want to hear that somebody's not having a good day or a good week. So, the society as a whole isn't necessarily as supportive as it could be. So moving on, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the challenges of working with advanced and metastatic cancer. This is something that's increasingly happening as treatments improve. And the line that health professionals will give an individual, which is, yes, this is treatable, but not curable, is one that we're increasingly hearing. Now, this means that very often people will have life-changing side effects. There'll be a huge degree of uncertainty about periods of wellness and changing treatment plans. But let's be clear, people can live with, I think it's a median of 3 years with a terminal illness, and sometimes 10 years or more. And they can work very successfully with the right support. The issue is that as soon as they say they have a terminal illness, and they may look fine, as I said earlier, very often an employer or a colleague will try and ease that person out of their job. And they won't think about how they can flex working policies and practices to support that person. But we're just running a campaign around metastatic cancer, and believe me, there are some very senior, effective people, as well as people working in supermarkets and on building sites. They're working very successfully with a terminal illness, and they can contribute hugely to their organizations and companies they work for if they're allowed and supported to do that. So, moving on. Just a few recommendations about what I think employers can do and policymakers and health professionals can do to support people with cancer. So that those numbers Stephen read out earlier about the numbers returning successfully to work can be improved. It's important to understand best practice. It's important to train line managers. And we're not talking here about a 1-hour lunch and learn here. We're talking about a proper training program where managers can understand, it doesn't just have to be about cancer, it be chronic illness and how to support someone with a chronic illness to work successfully. Cancer isn't just a 1-month project. I always remember somebody I met saying to me, yes, Barbara, this is all well and good, but we did cancer last year. Cancer is not something you do for 1 month or one period of time. It's something that an employer has to take on board all the time. Policymakers, I think it's really important that we look at the law in place to support cancer survivors. Many of you will have heard of the Dying to Work campaign, which is about providing cancer survivors with choices about whether they should work or give up work, rather than just perhaps have their employer say, well, you don't have the capacity and therefore I'm dismissing you, which is currently something that people can do under the law. So I think if employers could support the Dying to Work campaign, we can put something into the law about giving people with terminal illness choices. I think that would be a good thing to do. I think it's also important that it should be clear that people should be provided with workplace adjustments throughout their working life if they've had a cancer diagnosis, if they need those adjustments. And I think COVID has shown that people can work very successfully at home if their work allows them to, and therefore I think it should be a day one right to have flexible or blended working at least, if work allows an individual to do that. And then last but not least, I think health professionals could do a lot more to support cancer survivors in the workplace, by work becoming a clinical outcome, an important factor that clinicians take into account when they're deciding on treatment, and both active treatment and adjuvant treatment after active treatment is finished. But I think it would be really helpful if they could get some more time to learn how to communicate effectively with patients, more specialist training in cancer for occupational health professionals, and in general, if we integrate care much more with the world of work. It's a very unjoined up process at the moment, and very rare that an employer will have a meaningful conversation with a health professional about supporting a cancer survivor. So I'm going to end it there. I know I've spoken for a long time. I think, let's be clear, as more and more cancer patients of working age are successfully treated and return to work, employers will have to deal with the issues I've outlined. Standard policies and approaches aren't going to work, and employers do need to think much more carefully about the support they can provide to people like Stephen and myself so that people can return to work successfully. If you'd like to find out more about the work that we do, and we work with, I say, a number of large organizations, so more about our coaching, training and consultancy, please get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to support your employees so they can manage cancer and work successfully. Thank you.